Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Monroe, coming to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm joined by Judy Tuwaletstiwa, who is coming to you from Galisteo, New Mexico, and Dr. Rosita Worl, who's coming to you from Juneau, Alaska. We're happy to have you with us this afternoon, and I would encourage you, because we want this to be an open discussion, to submit your comments, questions, or observations on the chat feature on Zoom at any time, and we'll look forward to incorporating as many of those as we can. The whole issue of COVID and its long-term impact on us is something which I'm sure you have given some thought to, and all of us as we suffer through this unprecedented period for us at least, of staying at home, of having little social interaction, of spending considerable amount of our time, in the case of some of us, on Zoom, and living a completely different life than we lived just a few months ago. While many of the things that we've experienced are going to be fortunately short term, there are many others that we think are going to have a longer term impact. And in fact, they're kind of the sort of things that led to the title for this program, Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis, as you know, is a process by which something changes into something else that's completely and totally different. And we think that there are a number of things that are going on that will be outcomes of COVID once we return to some new normal, that will be long-standing effects of this experience. So that's what we want to talk about today, and we again encourage you to submit your ideas, suggestions, and questions. I'm going to turn it over to Judy and ask you to lead off, if you would, Judy, and share some of your thoughts about some of the impacts that you expect to be with us for considerable time, the long-standing impacts as a result of COVID.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, Rosita. Hi, Dan. I'm going to enlarge a little bit more on the idea of metamorphosis, because it is such a powerful concept. You know, there is evolution, and things change slowly over time. With metamorphosis, it's a very dramatic shift, and I suspect we'll have both evolution and metamorphosis from this experience of COVID, of, I'll get into that at another time. I just wanted to say, so what happens in the cocoon, which I didn't know, and it was part of where this concept came from, a friend wrote to me and said, the caterpillar doesn't just become the butterfly. That's not what happens. I'd always pictured its legs becoming wings and the basic body of the caterpillar staying intact. In fact, the caterpillar dissolves completely. It becomes a primordial soup. And within that soup, there are imaginal, and I love the term, imaginal discs that are floating. And those are the DNA that hold the butterfly. And I found that some of the studies that have been done on caterpillars who molt, caterpillars molt maybe 6 to 8 times during their life. And that there were studies done to see what caterpillars had an aversion to, or they could create an aversion for the caterpillar. And if it was done when the caterpillar was young, it didn't carry through to the butterfly. If it happened during the last 3 or 4 molts, the butterfly actually had the aversion to the same thing. I found that just fascinating. But these imaginal discs, so what I'm picturing is that during this period, and certainly here in my studio, that's what it's been like. I have actually relished the silence and relished the not knowing, the true not knowing. I mean, that's what I've been practicing for 50 years as an artist, is coming in here without knowing and seeing what happens. And that is a very powerful, that's how this period feels to me, because I think we can make some predictions. And what I've been doing is sort of gathering the material of all these years of work and seeing what new form it wants, what new shape, if it even wants that. So for me, it's been a time of profound questioning, and which does not mean that it's all been internal, but I do believe very strongly that the image has the power to heal. And that is something that needs to happen in the world with the other crises that have arisen during this time, and that have become much clearer. I feel we have a chance to see some things much more clearly right now as a society from the discomfort. I can't imagine what it feels like as a caterpillar to dissolve completely.
Rosita, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. But Dan, as you know, I am compelled by our cultural protocols to introduce myself in our Tlingit language. But first of all, let me say, Yi Duayakwan Anyat Kusani, most noble people of the world, most noble people of the land. Today we now have extended the meaning of that greeting, of that phrase, most noble people of the land, to also include most noble people of this virtual world, of this new world that we now have, that has extended far beyond our geographical barriers. Yadeklatak kakahani khatusak, trak na ayakhat, shangukwedi ayakhat, kauli ayihit ayakhat, sukakadi yadi ayakhat, juskatwan ayakhat. My Tlingit names are Yadeklatak, it's an ancient name that's been lost in time. My ceremonial name is Kahani. It means woman who stands in the place of a man. I am an eagle from the Thunderbird clan and the house lord from the sun. I'm also very proud to be a child of my father's clan, the Sukakadi, the Sakai clan from Chilkoot. I am also a Juskatwan. I am a Chilkat from Klukwan. You know, I had mentioned to Dan and Judy that I'm probably not the right person to be speaking to this, you know, really philosophical question that we should be thinking about. Because right now, as the head of a cultural organization, you know, I have to deal with the multiple crises that our people are facing in these challenging times. It's just, you know, one crisis after one after another. But yet then these things happen that make me reflect. Like a couple days ago, I participated in a ceremony where we were gifted a Chilkat woven mask, and in classic Chilkat weave. And I was given this gift to our organization. I was given it to it by a daughter of someone who had been trained by my grandmother. And I told her that, first of all, I was happy that she was carrying on the tradition from my grandmother to her mother to her, and now that she was teaching younger students. But I said it also, I used to hate it when my grandmother would be called the last of the Chilkat traditional weavers. I said she was never the last. And that, I don't know why people saw that as a break in our tradition. And so I thanked her for that. But I also said that the mask symbolized what we are going through right now in terms of bringing our ancient traditions symbolized by the weaving, the Chilkat weaving, but yet she had woven it into a mask that would protect our people. And I said it showed the remarkable adaptability of our people because we've had these experiences before. In 1918, when we had this flu epidemic introduced to us, our older people, those who were infected, would crawl away from their villages. They would crawl up into this natural amphitheater area because they didn't want to infect our people in the villages. And this was in my father's homeland, the Chilkoot. And I said, today we are doing the same. We have taken our ancient traditions, adapted them in a way that we can survive. So, but the other dimension of it was that this ceremony was photographed and featured on YouTube. And so we were reaching out, to many other people, many of our own tribal members that never would have been able to see some of the ceremonies that we have at home. And I will tell you that, that these new platforms have greatly expanded our world. We have different kinds of educational, cultural, art programs. And we made the decision that we are not going to let this pandemic stop us from living. We are not going to stop us from continuing our educational outreach. So we were able to transfer our programs to virtual platforms. And what we found is that it greatly expanded our world. One of our art demonstrations by our beautiful Lily Hope weaver, Chilkat weaver, usually, she has an artist in residence at our organization, the Alaska Heritage Institute. And maybe, 30, 40, 50 people would come to see her weaving. And in this instance, when she did her demonstration on this virtual platform, we had 20,000 people who were able to, to reach out, to enjoy, to learn about our culture. And that's what we've been trying to do, is trying to educate people about our culture, because we've always said that the suppression of our culture came from the outside world. So we thought it was really important for us to educate the outside world. So what's happening right now with these virtual platforms? It really is expanding our inclusiveness. We have all of these people who can now participate in our activities. But yet at the same time, this closure of public spaces, this closure of public buildings, of museums, of art places, it's shut that down. But yet we have this expansion through the virtual platform. But what it has brought to bear is it showing the inequities in our society, where our people who cannot afford to have a website, who cannot afford to have computers, our people who live in villages that don't have water, that don't have broadband. It shows the inequities, and it's brought it to the forefront. And I think, that's what's happening to us right now. These inequities, this whole thing with Black Lives Matter, I think has brought to the world, the inequities that we face. But yet the good thing about it is that it is also encouraging this dialogue, this discussion. And I know in Santa Fe you're having your issue with your statues down there. We're having the same over here with the Seward statue. And we have, some people who have brought out petitions and said, take it down, take Seward statue down. And I said, well, I have to teach our younger people about our history. So I told our people, I reminded our people that I reminded the public that we had already erected a shame pole of Seward. we put up a shame pole and reminded him that he owed a debt to the indigenous people who owned this land, and our land was taken and expropriated. But yet, when that statue first went up, I ran up to the governor's office and I said, I don't like that pole. And I said, but if you're going to put it up, then I want you to put up plaques around telling our history. And that didn't happen. The governor said it wasn't going to happen. And I said, well, maybe you could adopt this Truth and Reconciliation Commission that I've seen, in Canada have great success in bringing discussions between Native and non-Native people. And I was told, well, he already wrote a resolution talking about, bringing us together. But yet what came out of this, I can't tell you how happy I am, is I wrote the editorial and I went through the history of it. And today there was a response, an op-ed response. And in there, it talked about a gentleman, he said, I was very angry about this effort to take down the statue of William Seward. He said, but then I read Rosita's op-ed, and he said, it got me to think, and that is what we need at this point in time, is this dialogue between our peoples. And so, we are moving into a new world. We just had a celebration, a virtual celebration. And in it, one of our leaders said that we are being brought together virtually and spiritually. But then I was also reminded by one of our other elders. He said, Rosita, how much change can we expect before we are no longer clinking? So we have to have, kind of a base. This is the base. We will accept changes. We will do all of these changes, but we still have to be true to ourselves. And so I'm hoping, that through this pandemic, through all of this civil unrest, this convergence between, and this really challenge to the status quo, that white people control the world, I am hopeful that it's going to bring us to greater discussions. And I have to tell you, I am so happy to see that it is our youth who are leading the way in pushing for this, for greater equity, for a world that can respect differences.
So Rosita and Judy, thank you, Rosita and Judy, both. One of the things that it seems to be occurring with the situation, and it goes in several directions, is the fact that the normal social discourse that we have and the interactions that we have with people obviously have been profoundly interrupted by the requirement to stay at home, social distancing, and so on. And it's a fact that's already been documented that is actually producing for a really significant number of people a sense of anxiety for certain, and depression for many people, and making life difficult, because we're social animals. We're used to being interactive with people physically and at almost all times. And so this has created a very, very different kind of situation for us. One of the potential outcomes, because that likely will not persist, obviously, as we gain power over this pandemic. But one of the interesting implications of that is that there is a phenomenon that is occurring called the post-traumatic growth, which is a result of people having this experience and being at home and having more time to think about things. And I think that's contributed to what we see going on with regard to the issues of social inequity. So that people in many cases, I think, are really rethinking what it is that's important, what's important in our lives going forward, and thinking in new ways about what's important to them. Because having been forced out of the regular routine, it provides an opportunity to really recalibrate one's sense of values and priorities. So I'm hopeful that that'll be one of the things that comes out of all of this. And it certainly seems like it's contributing in part to the whole business about social inequity and social injustice, which you both touched on. So it's interesting to see if that in fact occurs. Judy, what else are you seeing?
I'm seeing, I'm thinking about the systemic problems that we have in this country. And I am seeing that this COVID-19 has stopped us in our tracks so that people do need to think about these things. That when today the three men were indicted for the murder of the jogger, Ahmed. And that is something we can actually pay attention to because we aren't running here and we aren't running there. We're not in the middle of all these different things. It's accessible. Rosita spoke about the internet and the power of bringing us together. I made myself watch the entire video of George Floyd's death. It seemed important to be a witness, to actually see it and pay attention to it. And I think as I've read these different companies and different places like Netflix and other places like this that have started to talk about some of these things, it's very powerful. I'm watching the film 13 about how our system of incarceration occurred, and Netflix featured that film. So it's a time when new information can come in, really are much clearer information. I mean, let's face it, I grew up when I was 14, Emmett Till was murdered. And that brought about some big changes, some big movements. And there are cycles. When I was 7 years old, the polio epidemic went across this country. My brother David wore braces and crutches his entire life because of that. I caught polio. It's like with COVID. I caught polio, and after 2 weeks, I was fine. Another little boy on our block died. And the whole country had to close down. But now, as Rosita has said, and you have said, we have this way of connecting with each other. And I see this is so essential, but I also feel that we have to find the proper language to talk about these issues. We can't just use jargon. It will not move us. When Rosita was speaking about writing that editorial and starting a discussion, I was thinking with the obelisk and the statues here, what would happen if they were put in a museum and the various stories told so that they became tools of education? And I think we have a crack here, an opening here, where we can deal with some of the big issues of our time if we don't just return to the old normal. One of them is climate change. This is a huge issue for everybody in this world. What language, what words do we find that don't simply say, this is how I see it, this is what matters, but really creates a dialogue? And I think, and not only a dialogue outside, I've always felt that we have to heal ourselves before we can heal anybody else. That the generational wounds, you talked about post-traumatic growth. Well, when you're descended, I was listening to this wonderful, it was on Being with Krista Tibbetts, interviewing this man, Matsima, who's a psychiatrist. And he was talking about the way that Blacks within our society carry post-traumatic stress from generations back, 400 something years here. And the way that whites I happen to be Jewish, so there's a different stress that we carry. There's a different trauma, and yet it's definitely related. But that during the Middle Ages, he was referring all the way back to the Middle Ages. And he says, this is a whole new way of starting to think how people who are mostly serfs and used so badly, how they still carry that trauma. And I feel that so much of what happens in our world is based on fear and anger, instead of the profound sorrow that underlies that part of the inheritance in people. And I would love to see forums where people can talk about the images that they carry close to their hearts, not just a political raised fist. I was raised in a very political family, and I don't trust revolution very far. I watched it from the inside. And all these different images that we throw on top of each other, I think we need to go deeper and deeper inside ourselves and to create places where people can do that safely.
How do you see that? How do you see that happening?
Well, Dan, you had a huge museum that you worked at for all those years. How did you go about doing that? How did you go about doing things related to this, to help people find a place of safety where art could help open them up?
Well, I think, the museum environment is certainly one in which there's opportunity to do that, and increasingly museums, thankfully, are spending much more time and energy paying attention to these kinds of issues than they did in the past. I think one of the questions that would be very, very interesting, at least in my mind, is this, that COVID is clearly going to have the least impact on the top 1% of people economically. The next 20% in the pyramid are going to have some impacts, but it's not going to be likely very devastating for that group. The other 79% of people are going to have really serious economic and related impacts because of COVID's disruption of the economy. And so it raises the question, a whole series of questions about what can be done to, as one witnesses this in a different way than just normal ways, this profound inequity that we have in our country. What can be done coming out of COVID, where this is going to become much more obvious than it has been in the past. I know, for example, my wife has volunteered at a food operation here in Santa Fe, and went down to help people who were in need of food, and went very early in the morning, and something like 600 cars showed up. I mean, that's just not something that's normally visible to us. So the question is, what can we think about doing that carries forward in this period in which we see these inequities, which have been there all along? What can we do carrying forward that may help us overcome them to some extent? I don't know, Rosita, what are your thoughts? You've got, problems of economic problems in terms of Alaska, even though it has been a very rich state. Certainly many of the native communities in Alaska are not rich, and people are struggling, living subsistence lifestyles, but even subsistence is threatened in many ways. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, there's multiple things that are going on here, but I just like to address this one first on, we are, our communities are really like fourth world countries yet. I mean, we're still better off, than Navajo if we have running water. In fact, we have lots of water, but we still have a lot of inequities in our communities. And our communities right now, most of them are isolated, they're rural communities. Our communities are not connected by road. And so when the pandemic came, everything shut down. But also what shut down was the basic life stream into our villages with the ferry system. And so the ferry system shut down. The food supply was closed down, not so much from the pandemic, but from the fiscal crisis in the state and the fact that villages were, not priorities. And so our people, we live in a land of plenty. Our land, it really, our rich resources around our villages, really supported the development of the very rich Northwest Coast culture. But yet here are people who are, facing hunger. Food security became an issue. And so we went immediately to the regulatory agencies and said, we have to be able to allow our people to hunt and fish. I mean, we can't be regulated by open season, closed season when people, are hungry. And our people in the villages said, we are not going to have our people starve, because of some regulatory regime that will not allow us to hunt in a closed season. But we went through the process. And there was this process. We applied. We went to the fishing. We went to the subsistence board. I'm on the subsistence committee for the Alaska Federation of Natives, and so we asked for this for the managers at the local level to be able to relax the rules or change the rules so our people could hunt and fish. And we celebrated when it was announced that yes, they would allow them to have this decision. But they put it in one caveat, and they said, but the state of Alaska, the officials have to approve of it. So the state of Alaska comes back and says, well, there's no real food security issue. I mean, there's still groceries, on the shelves. There are still, the ferries have been rebooted and they're going into the village. And I said, well, that's all well and good. But what about the fact that there are no jobs? All of the economic opportunities disappeared. And our people depend, I think like a lot of the people around, the Native Americans around Santa Fe, they depend on arts and crafts sales. And with the closure of the visitors industry, it closed down those economic opportunities for our people in the villages. But Fish and Game Guide did not take into consideration any of those kinds of things. So what it says to me that we really need to have, our people involved. We need to be participating at all of those decision-making levels. So just in that one example of how, how the turmoil of the current crisis is affecting our villages. And again, pointing out, to what I see as injustices where we are not, equal participants in the political process.
So maybe one of the things that comes out of this is there's a different participation by people than there has been. And I think it's going to take some patience as well as very hard work to make that possible. And I think I love how many of the young people are getting involved in things here. And I do think there can be a lot of help from us old people who went through other things in our lives, like Vietnam, when we were young and we questioned some of the systemic things within our society. How do we work together is my question. Because if we're working against each other during this, there's enough anger to fuel that. How do we take that? And as an artist, I feel it's part of my responsibility as an artist to help that kind of dialogue grow. And that's part of the power of art. And I feel every single person that I've ever met has art within them. And it's
Judy,
somehow through that other, what, Dan, you were?
no, go ahead. I was just going to say, Judy, one of the questions that we've got from a member of our audience is the question about how the pandemic is affecting art and artists and their work. You're touching on that. Can you explore that a little
Very
bit more?
different. Different artists I know very, very differently. You know, each artist, most of the artists that I know are going deeper into themselves, but not, they're looking at this period of cocooning, of transformation. I mean, because that's what art's finally about, isn't it? Isn't that part of why we look at art, is to transform something within ourselves?
Right.
And we're in a profound period of transformation. That's why I think it's so hard to see what's going to happen with it. I mean, we haven't even discussed the climate change. This could be the first of how many pandemics? Who knows? When Dr. Fauci says, in my 40 years, I have never seen anything that acts like COVID, I really pay attention to that. And yes, it is bringing out the inequities. That's important. That's what needs to be happening. What if it were just, we were just going on the way that we were? This is like a perfect wave happening here, a perfect storm with these different waves saying, stop, look, start listening to each other in a different way. This is not working for everybody. And of course, you can never see the way the whole cloth is woven. You know, we're each so tiny. And how one thing creates something else that happens. But this is a big storm. This one's a big storm because we don't even see the end of it. Now you're hearing about the third wave, the second wave, the third wave. We don't have our fingers on the pulse of this. It's almost like this morning I said to my husband, you know, with Trump, I said, it's like the Kardashians are running the government. I mean, it's like this superficial approach to things that we have to find new ways of working with. And I don't know the ways, but I know that each person that I know is thinking about this and trying to hear as well as to be able to help. I think it's an incredible opportunity for us. We were just going so fast in this society.
Well, one of the interesting things that
Dan,
yeah.
can I answer that? Can I also answer that?
Sure, absolutely.
Because it's been a major issue for us up here. I mean, well, you know, the Northwest Coast culture, art is integrated into everything that we do.
Yes.
For your information, Art, Dan, I don't know if I told you that we did discover a word for art. People have always said that we didn't have a word for art
Really?
in our language. It's atnane. It means, it refers to an iconic event, and it was an iconic event that led to the visual representation of our crests. That is what art is in our language. And
That's great.
we found out through one of our Council of Traditional Scholars meetings. But anyway, you know, we've really been promoting the arts at Sealaska Heritage Institute, and we've integrated art into all levels. We're teaching it in preschool, elementary, high school. We started an art program at the University of Alaska. We, a nonprofit, are putting $1 million into the university system to teach Northwest Coast art. And we've brought back a lot of endangered art. So we've really pushed art, you know, to a very prominent place in our society. But it also means that it's artists and it's also craftspeople. And a lot of art people have become very dependent on the sale of their art, you know, through the tourist industry. And so when that disappeared, it really hit our community really hard. And we tried our very best, to try to continue to purchase art, craft, from our people. But then I noticed, what happened was that the foundations that have been supporting our museums, like for art acquisitions, they pulled that money away, and they said, well, we're going to try to figure out how do we help artists. And so there were some changes that ended up hurting the very artists that they were trying to help. And I kept saying, I'm going to tell you this: art people don't know how to fill out all of those applications that, where they're recognized as a great artist. They do not know how to fill out those applications. And so our people really hit hard by art organizations, well-meaning, well-intentioned, but not knowing the realities of the world that our people live in, that produce things that are made for sale. And then they were hit with this unemployment benefits. And I have 2 grandchildren who are artists, so I know intimately, from their experience, as well as trying to support, the 300 artists that we have cultivated and that we represent, in our store, the Alaska Heritage Store. And so it is at the forefront of the problems that we're trying to deal with. And, I don't know what all the answers are. We went online, I said, and, my modus operandi was say, okay, look at the opportunities this creates. So we, went online, and I said, we shut our store down, so we couldn't buy, from the artists that we usually support. We have 300 artists that we, sell for us. But now this online sales are beginning, to take hold. So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that when we come back, to post COVID-19, that our world is going to be different. We are going to be having to continue, our art production, our art sales through our store, but we're also going to have to reach out to this virtual world, because our virtual world has significantly expanded our world. So every program, I've said to our staff, every program that we have, to the extent that we are able to, we are going to have an in-person program, but we're also going to add in this virtual dimension. So, virtual exhibits, our staff is already planning virtual exhibits. So and that's one of the ways, that I know that our world is going to change, is we're going to add the virtual dimensions to our ongoing work. But if I could add one more thing that you raised earlier, and I think it's important to talk about, how is it affecting our youth? And, we have a very young staff at Alaska Heritage, all young, dedicated professionals. And I've had to live through the personal, emotional turmoil that they are experiencing. First, going from working in an office to working by themselves at home, and then having, single mothers having to take care of their children all by themselves. And so, we've tried to figure out how do we help our staff in that area. Then came the Black Lives Matters. And then we saw the conflicts occurring. A lot of our staff are also non-native, and they were having these conflicts at home between, generations, where older generations were not always aligned with Black Lives Matter. We're resenting the changes that were coming about. And so we've had to try to, work with our younger staff people to deal with those kind of conflicts that they are having at home. And I reminded them, you work for an institution whose goal is to promote cross-cultural understanding and to promote cultural and support cultural diversity. And it turns out that one of our staff people was the one who started the petition to take down the Seward statue. I didn't know she was doing that, and she did it all by herself. But right now she's coming under assault. She's, having threatening phone calls. So this morning, what was I doing? I was, calling. I said, okay, make sure, that take her name down off of our website. call the police, tell her, that, she's, we know that she's being threatened, and tell her that if she needs to move, she can move into, one of our houses. We'll take care of her. We're a family. But I want people to know that our young people are going through these kinds of things, even as they continue to try to figure out how do we work, how do we continue our work in this new world. But I just wanted to bring up our young people.
I think, Rosita, calling it this new world, we're in the middle of the societal changes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when the monsters fly around. It's the time of metamorphosis. And there aren't any, I think part of what I hear you talking about is our taking care of each other, our reaching out and taking care of you. You can come and stay here if this is going on. And that there's a different way that we have to structure our societies. Certainly down here in the lower 48, there's something else, and it's been wanting for a long time. Now it's right in front of us. And I don't think there are any easy answers to any of this, but it's going to force us to take care of each other in different ways than back in the 80s, they predicted what would happen with the 1%. It was predicted back then. COVID was not predicted. But what was, and believe me, some of that 1% are people who are very generous in this world and do some amazing work around the world. If we can come out of this seeing each other as people, helping other people, and that has to happen on so many levels, the whole idea of story. I heard about a company where they just said, and this is a big company, this week we are not making anything, we're not selling anything, we are having Zoom talks where people of color within our company talk about their experiences of life. And you all discuss this with each other. That's the kind of thing that I think has to start happening. I think true dialogue.
So
without hitting each other over the head with jargon, but true dialogue. And Rosita was talking about some of that dialogue.
One of our participants has asked a question about that you just touched on, Judy, which is how should we think about reaching out to the other, like the act of hatred that occurred in one of our Indian restaurants right here in Santa Fe. The question really is, in part, the whole division that we've created between various elements of our society so that we have others. And I think that while COVID highlights the inequalities that exist in our society and in our culture, situations like this, and this is certainly true in terms of social action and activity, but also in other arenas as well. That, for example, in the cultural arena in this country, COVID has obviously had a catastrophic impact, closed everything down. There are many, many organizations, art and cultural organizations that were in very, very fragile financial shape before COVID. And it seems pretty clear that, that there's going to be a pretty high attrition rate. And one of the things that happens, which is painful, but can also be a positive thing, and this is true for institutions as well as individuals, is that in these periods of intense pressure that's unexpected and unanticipated, there often occur responses that are very creative and innovative. So creativity is often spawned by unanticipated pressures, things that changes the normal. And so I think one of the things that that we can think about as a possible answer to the question about what can you do to change these conditions beyond the notion of dialogue, because dialogues are really, really hard to engineer, but they're really, really important, is to become much more creative in thinking about the ways in which we interact with each other, and particularly people whose beliefs and experiences are very different than our own. And so there's not a prescription for that, but there's opportunity for us to begin doing some new things that we really haven't done in the past, and to think about different kinds of stories, different kinds of ways of interacting, different approaches than the ones that we've employed up to this point, because it's clear they haven't in many ways worked very well. We're getting close to a wind-up time.
Dan,
Yeah.
Dan, I just wanted to quickly say something. I was reading this poem about dominate or breathe. And in this poem, an anonymous author spoke about the earth saying, I can't breathe.
Right.
And then a COVID patient saying, I can't breathe. George Floyd saying, I can't breathe. And these different levels of I can't breathe. And do we choose domination or do we choose breathing? Because this isn't just about human beings either. It's not just about us. We have an entire world here that is saying it's 100 degrees today in Siberia for the first time ever in history, in recorded history. So we're talking about, with something like what happened with the Indian restaurant, people are immediately, all of us, donating money to fix it up. That's one way that people are reacting to it, is a GoFundMe that is raising lots of money very quickly. And of course, we've discussed money in some ways. You could have another whole discussion about Make America Money Again, and what is money as this exchange, and Rosita's touched on some of that, on some of the needs. I mean, there's so many layers of this, but I think it does come down to really hearing each other and the difference between domination and breathing.
So we have about 5 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is ask each of you to just share your final thoughts in about a minute and a half, very concise, about what some of the hopeful things, because we've touched on a lot of things that are very, very serious problems and are things that we have to address. But what are some hopeful things that you would like to see and think may come out of all of this? Let's start with you, Rosita.
We just had, I mentioned we just had our virtual celebration, and we adopted as its theme, Yi Duaya Juan, take courage, take courage. And we were reminding our people that, we've come through these epidemics before, but we have survived. And we have survived by coming together, as a people, but now also coming together with all of the other people who have been outside of our world, but who now, we now live in the state of Alaska together. I was so heartened, to read that response to my editorial. That, here I was very angry, but then I read something and it made me think. And this is the time where we are thinking. But we have to also, and I was trying to figure out, how do we answer that question? What do we do about dealing with this hatred? And I think we have to move beyond, Facebook, I hate Facebook, but yet I still go on and I watch it because I want to see what people are thinking about. There's no real dialogue there. It just, people continue to espouse their views. But what I've seen happen here in Juneau is that some of our organizations have created these spaces for dialogue. And some of them have done them in different ways where they say, okay, today we'll have all young white people. Tomorrow we'll have all young Native people. Then we'll come together. I mean, I think we have to look, at different kinds of alternatives. What can we do that's different? We have to look for those solutions. But I am an optimistic person, and I know that we're going to come out stronger and better for it, because we still have, we've come through 10,000 years, and we know that. We as a people, I know that scientifically. I can go through our archaeological data, I could go through DNA studies, and we have been here for 10,000 years. We've lived through different climate change, global warming, freezing, and we have survived. So I think we really need to bring to the surface, all of those values. And that's what it's almost, I was thinking, gosh, we're almost like a church, where we're teaching our values. But maybe that's what we need to do, is bring our values to the forefront, to educate one another, and also have this dialogue with the younger generation. This is the first time in history where elders are learning from their youth, and we have to be open to that, to their perspectives.
Fantastic. Thank you. Judy?
I guess I would sum it up as saying, how do we stand in these dissolving boundaries? Because that is, I'm going back to the metaphor of the cocoon again, and the dissolving caterpillar, that our boundaries are dissolving here in a way that is, again, a perfect storm of that. And most people, boundaries hold us in. And right now we're standing in those boundaries as they're dissolving. So education, talking, going inside, helping each other, these are all such basic things. But what I would say, for me, the image that most comes to mind right now is how we're standing in these boundary lines, and they're dissolving around us. We need to form new ways of being with each other all around the world, all around the world.
Rosita and Judy, thank you so much for taking your time, sharing your thoughts with us today. I would just add that I think that in times of incredible pressure and unanticipated challenges, again, it gives us an opportunity to step back, to your point, Judy, and think in new ways, and to look at the world in new ways, which are forced on us of necessity, and help make it even easier to think about what could we be doing that's different? How can we approach ourselves and the world? How can we look at our own values and those of others in new ways? And how do we take this incredibly difficult set of challenges that COVID has created and turn them into something positive and lasting that's a benefit to the human spirit and to our creativity and to our future, and not only of mankind, humankind, but of all life on Earth. So with that, I want to thank you all for participating. Thank you again, Judy. Thank you, Rosita.
Thank you, Dan and Rosita.
We look forward to seeing you again on a CCA Living Room Series program. Thanks all.
Thank you.